Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this gut reaction webinar. Thank you for joining us at our third event, looking at the Gut Reaction Health Data Hub and how we are going to be using health data for research into the causes and treatments of IBD. My name is Amanda Stranks, and I am the project manager for the patient and public involvement section of the Health Data Hub. So I do lots of this kind of thing, public engagement events, sharing with members of the public, such as yourselves, what it is that our hub is going to be doing, and I'm going to be hosting today. Gut Reaction aims to bring together expertise from across IBD research, including researchers themselves, doctors, clinicians, and of course, most importantly, patients. And what we're aiming to do is to bring all sorts of health data from patients and people living with IBD together to support research. Throughout this series so far, we've had two webinars previously. We've been joined by different experts from within Gut Reaction to look at how the hub works. Today's sort of episode, as it were, today's webinar is going to be looking at how IBD clinicians are going to use and are planning to use Gut Reaction for research to improve patient care. We're going to be joined by some leading clinicians from the field, Professor Miles Parks, who's a consultant gastroenterologist at Cambridge, and Dr. Nick Kennedy, as well as two members of our patient advisory committee, Rosanna Fennessy and Caroline Brocklehurst. And together we're going to discuss what questions they would like to see answered through Gut Reaction. Thank you to everyone who has submitted questions in advance for this event. We've been really impressed and amazed, quite frankly, at the volume of questions that come in. So please do understand if we can't get to everyone's questions today, but you are also welcome to use the Q&A box as you go along. At the bottom of your screen, there should be a little button where you can put your questions in. Do please be aware, though, that we can't answer your personal medical questions, but we would love to see your thoughts on what questions or topics that you would like to see researchers using Gut Reaction to study. So that sounds about enough from me. Today, now I'd like to welcome our speakers for today. So starting with Professor Miles Parks, who, as I said before, is a consultant gastroenterologist at Cambridge University's hospitals, and he's also the clinical and research collaboration workstream lead at Gut Reaction. So welcome, Miles, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and thanks everybody for joining us on today's webinar. Hopefully this will be informative for you, and we'll do our best to, as Amanda says, to pick up on the questions that you're pitching at us. Briefly, for my own introduction, I'm a gastroenterologist, as Amanda said. I've been quite involved in the world of genetics research for many years now, and somewhat involved in the world of the bugs that live inside us, so-called the microbiome. But thankfully, we've got Nick Kennedy on the call on the webinar today, who's a much bigger expert in that area than I am, certainly.
Brilliant. So exactly as Miles says, we are also joined by Dr. Nick Kennedy, who is also a consultant, and in this case at the Royal Devon and Exeter NHS Foundation Trust. So thank you very much for dialing in today. It's really kind of you to join us.
Thanks, Amanda. Yes, I'm a gastroenterologist in Exeter. We're in the process of merging together the eastern and northern parts of Devon into one thing. So I'm actually up in North Devon today, helping support them here, but taking a break from that to join you today. I've been a gastroenterologist in Exeter for about 6 years. I've got an interest in inflammatory bowel disease, both clinically and from the point of view of research, including genetics and microbiome and so forth, as well as looking at drug response. I'm also very interested in how we can best use routinely collected health data and best use informatics, so computer systems and so forth, to answer important research questions in health in general and inflammatory bowel disease in particular.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and for taking the time out to do that. I imagine the reorganisation is quite something. So again, very much appreciate the time. As well as our two clinicians today, we're joined by two members of our patient advisory committee. So firstly by Rosanna Fennessy, who is our patient partner for Gut Reaction. Rosanna's been involved in this project right from the very early stages of development and continues to play a vital role. So hello, Rosanna.
Hello, lovely to be here this afternoon. As Amanda said, yes, I've been involved in Gut Reaction for some time, patient with Crohn's disease, and looking forward to talking a bit more about the hub this afternoon.
Brilliant, thanks, Rosanna. And then last but definitely not least, by Caroline Brocklehurst, who's also a member of our patient advisory committee. Hi, Caroline.
Hi, everyone. Hi, I'm glad to be here. As Amanda says, I'm a patient representative, joined a bit more recently than Rosanna on the patient advisory committee for Gut Reaction.
Brilliant. And the schedule for today is we're going to go through and I'm going to discuss several topics with our panel, but we also have time for our Q&A event at the end. So as I said earlier, please, everyone, please put your questions in as we go along. And thank you very much for joining us today. Miles, if I could start with you to help us set the scene, could you give us a bit of a recap on what gut reaction is and why it was important to create?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. So gut reaction, I'm sorry we're going to be using a few sort of jargony words here. It was born out of a thing that we call the IBD bioresource. And that itself was born out of a big genetics program that we've been running in many centres around the UK. Trying in the old days, essentially just collecting DNA samples from people who've got Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis and just seeing if we could work out what the genetic risk factors were. And I see this is one of the questions actually, which genes actually predispose or gene variants predispose to development of ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. In about 2015, we asked ourselves the question, well, this is all very well finding out this stuff, but we need to do something that's a bit more closely connected to the clinical, to what we do in the clinic and how we might help people and patients who have got Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And that was really where the IBD bioresource was born. The idea here now being rather than just collecting a DNA sample and doing analysis on that, that we could, as it were, remain in touch with the participants, and partly based on the information that we got from them, partly based on the genetic readouts that we were getting from each individual, that we could contact people and invite them back to come and help us in other research. So, you know, if you get a particular genetic variant in a particular gene, NOT2 is a gene that we all talk about in Crohn's disease, and you were interested to understand about that, how variation in that gene increases risk of Crohn's disease, then you want to look at lots of people who've got variation in NOT2. And of course, the bioresource allows you to do that. We can go all the way down to a very specific mutation or very specific single variant. And with now 36,000 or so people with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis across the UK participating, usually we've got plenty of people with each of these gene variants, and we can invite them and say, look, you know, we've got Nick Kennedy in Exeter, or we've got Charlie Lees in Edinburgh, or we've got Christian Sellinger in Leeds, who wants to particularly collect some blood samples from people with your particular genetic makeup and do some downstream experimental work on that. And we can now do that, and that's been a very useful thing. Not just in genetics, actually, in lots of other things as well, particular clinical characteristics that the patients have got. What was gut reaction? So gut reaction was really an attempt to ramp up the amount of information that we held on the participants. Not in everybody across IBD bioresource, but in selected hospitals, Nick's hospital in Exeter being one, Cambridge being another, and there are about 10 others around the country, where for each of the participants in the IBD bioresource, we would be able to access routinely collected healthcare data. So laboratory test results, radiology results, even X-ray images, and line that up in drug response, prescription data, line that up with the genetics data and more what we call longitudinal, so long-term clinical follow-up, to give us a much more detailed view as to what was going on and what are the, you know, you'll have, I imagine people on this webinar probably have come across machine learning and AI. It's how do you use all of this information aggregated together to tell you useful things? Can you predict who's going to respond to a particular treatment? Can you predict who's going to have a particularly difficult time with their Crohn's disease and so on and so forth? So that really is what gut reaction has been all about, is to assemble that big lump of data together and make it available to anybody who's got an approved, who's a bona fide researcher and who's got an approved project, which gets reviewed by our data access committee in a very rigidly controlled way, but that for genuine investigators, we give them opportunity to look at these data and to gain some insights.
Thank you. So to paraphrase a little bit, thanks to the lovely contributions of all of the people living with IBD participating in research right across the country. So you said from Edinburgh to Exeter, didn't you?
It is.
Gut reaction aims to bring all of that data together so that researchers can kind of use it or access it in one place. So roughly what you're saying, you think?
It really does. And our patient access committee and the work of Rosanna and Caroline and their colleagues has been really instrumental in shaping how we think about these data sets, how we can use them, what the patient cohort are comfortable with, which is obviously critically important as well. And that's been a very important part of gut reaction as well.
And gut reaction is one of a number of hubs, in this case, of course, focusing on inflammatory bowel disease. Is there anything particular about IBD that makes it really amenable to this kind of research, or why IBD, for want of a better description?
Yeah, I think the IBD community, patients and clinicians, have done a good job over the years of coming together and working in a cohesive way. I think other patient groups, some do that okay, but many don't have quite that sort of cohesive feel to them. As well, as I mentioned at the beginning, that a lot of this work sprang out of the genetics, and Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are much more genetic than many other common diseases. And so I think that gave us a bit of a head start as well in terms of the potential utility of this sort of thing. It also meant that we as investigators around the country, we all knew each other because we'd already been working with each other for years, decades actually, turns out, on these sorts of endeavors. So those sorts of personal relations, I think, work really well. They're really important to make these things successful as well.
Yeah, so the perfect combination of the right people, the right expertise, the right data thoughts made it look really, really promising. I think that makes a lot of sense. Rosanna and Caroline, as patients, then, how did you get involved in gut reaction, and what was it that specifically appealed? Rosanna, I think if we start with you.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, I was already a patient representative on the bioresource that Miles was talking about. And then I was asked if I'd have a look over this idea for this kind of research hub from a patient perspective. And I think when I read it originally, I was really excited. And it really meant that for the first time, you'd see so much more about a patient. So we already were looking at the genetics and we had some information about lifestyle, but this idea that you could really get this complete picture. Of course, on the other hand, that also meant lots more data, potentially sensitive data. So I think for me, it was like I could see the potential, but I really wanted to make sure that patients were at the kind of center of how this project moved forward. And after it got the go-ahead, I was invited to be a patient partner on it. And that's been over 3 years ago now since all that started. And I continue to, fly the flag for patients and members of the public about, what a good idea this is, but how important it is done in a secure, controlled and approved way. So very much working together with the team.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. And Caroline, what about you?
So as I mentioned at the outset, I've been a more recent appointee to the Patient Advisory Committee. I've been involved for around about a year now, but it's been a very busy year. Lots of involvement opportunities, which have been really interesting and exciting. So like Rosanna, I am a patient. I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease in 2009, like many patients, lots of ups and downs in my journey. In autumn 2020, had a nasty relapse, escalated in treatment, and I really felt I should do more to contribute to help fellow patients as well as my own journey. And I recognised that research improvements are really fundamental in that. It's so important to have make a contribution to research to ultimately improve patients' lives. When I found out about gut reaction, having not come from a data background or a science background, I still find it a really exciting opportunity. It is, I believe, the world's largest health data hub specifically around IBD. So the opportunity that comes from that for really improving the quality and progress of research seemed really exciting to me. And I also, like Rosanna, felt that with that opportunity came a lot of responsibility, and I felt it was really crucial that patients' voices were represented and heard, and that was a crucial aspect. So that's kind of what led me to the project.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, thank you both for joining us and supporting us for the whole way. It definitely makes a difference to the work that we do. Nick, as an IBD clinician, what do you think gut reaction adds that other forms of research couldn't?
So I think Miles has already alluded to some of this, but in research, we're good at going out and finding patients to do studies, and we often will have a set of questions we ask patients as part of recruiting them to the study. we'll sometimes then ask clinicians or research nurses to get particular points of information from the patient record, and then we might have some blood samples or stool samples or something that we want to measure. And that allows us to answer lots of really important questions. But quite often, particularly when it comes to trying to get research teams to extract information from the record, there's quite a lot of duplication of effort. We're asking them to take something that's already been recorded once and then to record it again, and that obviously introduces a human error step. But also there's a limit to how much we can feasibly ask teams to do. So we might be able to ask them the latest C-reactive protein measurement at the point someone was recruited to a study. We're probably not going to ask them to record all 50 CRPs that a patient might have had over the last 5 years. And so gut reaction brings together those sort of first things that we've been doing in research for quite a while. So the research specific samples, as well as the research specific questions to patients and teams, with a lot of sort of structured and unstructured clinical data. So all of these lab results, the histology reports, ideally in the fullness of time at least, whole slide imaging, so we can actually look at detail from the individual specimens that have been taken from people's bowels as they look like down a microscope, and then do these sophisticated sort of AI and machine learning techniques that Miles has referred to. And I think that provides us some really interesting opportunities to look for patterns in the data that we might otherwise miss, because we, you know, unless we have that really big data set across hundreds or thousands of patients, we don't have the opportunity to ask the question in that way. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity, and I think it, as I said, I think this idea that we record things well once in the patient record, and then with the appropriate ethical permissions in place, we can use those data to answer research questions as well, is a really valuable one.
Because I think on the surface, gut reaction is a really simple idea. This idea, you know, we've got all this data anyway, as you say, because we've got these research projects and stuff, but it sounds like in the practice, bringing it together is actually quite complex. So for a clinician, I think of you down there in Exeter, as it were, what does it mean to actually get that data out of your hospital and into gut reaction? It's not as easy as it sounds, is it?
No, I think it's a lot of people, I think, are used to the fact that things like banking and so forth, you know, you can use that, you can stick your bank card into a machine in Exeter and you bank with the Royal Bank of Scotland, and everything sort of links up and you get your money out. And perhaps also with increasingly things like general practice, where they're used to being able to see at least some of their GP data through a single app, no matter which practice they're with. Secondary care data is much more fragmented. Some of it is collected centrally for reporting purposes, but a lot of it's held by individual hospitals. Hospitals use different varied hospital systems to store that, and increasingly hospitals are moving to using a single system to hold everything. But in many hospitals around the country, there'll still be, you know, clinician might log into 5 or 6 systems when they're in their outpatient clinic to access the blood results and the radiology and the discharge summary from their hospital admission, and sometimes they won't even have some access to some of that information at all. Up until we moved to our current system 2 years ago, I couldn't tell if a patient had been to the emergency department recently unless they told me, which always is a little bit awkward when it's in your own hospital. So there's lots of fragmentation of information into different systems, and it's different between different hospitals, and that does bring challenges when you're trying to design a project like this. I'm unusual in that I guess I'm both a clinician but also a bit of a data geek, and I have an interest in the way data is stored in these systems and can be extracted. So I've been very involved for my own hospital with gut reaction at getting the data out. In most hospitals, it's more going to be a case of identifying the right people within the business intelligence department or within IT or whichever departments are handling those data. Obviously, persuading them of the importance of what we're doing, and then working with them to identify the correct patients and get the data out in a format that can be transmitted to Cambridge as part of the study. Mm-hmm. It's also key, you know, that obviously this is all underlined by ethical permission and by patient consent, but I also work closely with our information governance team to ensure that the data flows and the pseudonymization and all of these other things that are really important were up to scratch, and so we got all of that through, and we were happy that this was an appropriate thing to be doing with our patient data.
Mm-hmm. And I certainly think our patients would be reassured to know that we're not just sending this data everywhere, but it does really underline the need for both the expertise, like yourself, as you say, as a data specialist, but something like gut reaction to be able to bring it all together. So changing tack slightly, the reason we wanted to do today was to talk about why it is so exciting and the things that we could do with this data. So to kind of kick us off on that, Nick, as a clinician, could you describe what gut reaction might mean for you in terms of what you might be able to do in future for your patients?
So I think we've learned a lot about inflammatory bowel disease over the last 20, 30 years with the genetic studies and so forth we've done, but there's still lots of unanswered questions. I think we still don't really know how much this is sort of one or two diseases, or whether it needs to be divided into lots of smaller parcels. We know that we're not very good at predicting which patients respond to which therapies. We've got an increasing array of drugs out there, but we, in terms of trying to select those, we'd like to be able to be at a point where we could say, looking at this patient's genetics, or their stool sample, or their age, or some other parameters that we can measure, the right drug for them is drug X, whereas the patient next door we give drug Y, but we're still a long way off that. And I think these large scale data sets, with lots of, both large in terms of patient numbers, but also large in terms of the number of measurements that we've got, provide us with a really good opportunity to try and move those things forwards. And I think that that with gut reaction and the WBR is also a sort of partnered up with other projects looking specifically at drug response, which should give us really exciting opportunities to answer some of these questions around which drug to use, in which sequence, in which patient.
I think that makes sense. Caroline, does that resonate with you as a patient? Is that kind of what you would dreamed gut reaction would do, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, like many patients over, well, for me, 13 years, I've had to navigate the whole relapse and remission cycle and different treatment responses and so on. As well as my own lived experience, I do voluntary work with patient support groups and so on, and I regularly hear about the struggle with the whole trial and error approach to treatment, and also the struggle with the variations of the disease and different treatment journeys and so on, and the resultant impact that has on all aspects of patients' lives, certainly clinically, and in terms of things like, the actual erosion that the disease actually brings, but also, of course, patient suffering, and that's both physical and mental, of course, and also importantly on the whole health economics of IBD, which is important, and that dramatically affects our NHS and our accessibility to treatments and so on. So I think then it really highlighted the need and opportunity of gut reaction to kind of constructively improve all of those aspects for patients.
Excellent. And Rosanna, do you have anything that you'd like to add on top of that?
Only very briefly, because Caroline has summed it up brilliantly, and we have very similar stories. I was diagnosed a bit before Caroline, but also that very up and down. So things that work for a little while and then they stop working, various biologics, and for me that also ended up having some major surgery as well. So I think it is that impact on all aspects of your life. I had to give up the work I was doing at the time and things like that. So I think I really wanted to be involved in something that might help others not to have to go through this. And very recently, a member of my family's also been diagnosed with Crohn's disease as well. And so all of a sudden, that genetic link suddenly becomes a lot more kind of important and relevant. So yeah, and I'm sure there are many people listening who have very similar experiences.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. We've heard from both of our clinicians the role that gut reaction plays using some of the data that's generated in original clinical trials. Miles, could you tell us a little bit more how gut reaction plans to kind of work alongside trials? How does it work sort of on the data side and the primary research side, as it were?
I think there are lots of different layers to that question, to be honest with you. From the sort of formal clinical trials aspect, which is often led by pharmaceutical industry or other people, I'm very keen that we use gut reaction and the IBD bioresource to help support recruitment of these trials. These trials do play a pivotal role in bringing new treatments into play. I'm aware that because this has been an interesting discussion we've had with our patient groups, that there are sometimes sensitivities with patients and participants about sharing their data with commercial organizations and industry and so on. And I fully understand the background for that. I guess the point I would make is that ultimately we rely on these commercial entities and industry partners to help bring new treatments into play. And so things that we can do to help them ultimately go full circle and ultimately hopefully as well help the patient community. There are definitely one of the, and as Nick's alluded to this point already, there are more and more new treatments coming through. It's getting increasingly difficult to work out who do you use which treatment in first. Whether genetics or some other aspects of the data that we will be holding in gut reaction will allow us to understand that. We don't yet know, but it's a completely sensible question to be asking. Either at the clinical trial stage, and many of the new drugs that are coming through in development try and build in what's called a biomarker program alongside them. So for the commercial point of view, if a company can demonstrate that they've identified particular aspects of the disease which make it more likely that patients will respond to their particular treatment, that gives them a route into what's now quite a crowded marketplace, if you call it that, patients with active inflammatory bowel disease where we need to control it. And you know, from the company's perspective, they want their drug to go in first. From a patient's perspective, they want a drug that's going to work. From the clinician's perspective as well, that more on the sort of patient side. And if things that we can do that help us to pick the right drug first time, definitely going to play well there. And I do see that gut reaction is going to be potentially able to play a pivotal role in supporting those sorts of questions. And hopefully as more companies play this a bit smarter and come through with the idea of using, whether it's genetically stratified or stratified by other means, approaches. Nick's already mentioned the microbial biomarker project, which again is a study that's in setup at the moment, and which is closely affiliated to the IBD bioresource and gut reaction program, but whereby we're collecting stool samples and studying the composition of the bugs that live in people's bowels, because there's some quite good suggestion or evidence that those also have quite a significant impact on the likelihood of treatment response and so on. So I see the role for these things, both in terms of the, as it were, the index clinical trials, as it were, being able to do stratified analysis, so-called stratified analysis, selecting by genotype, what have you, but also, and again, these are programs which we're already running now that we've got the gut reaction data set together, also taking a sort of retrospective look at the treatments that we're already using to see if we can better understand how do you define the subgroups of people who respond to those treatments. It's always more difficult doing these things in retrospect, of course, because you end up with a rather biased analysis if you're not careful. But these are challenges that we're certainly pointing gut reaction at.
So there's sort of an element of looking back at earlier clinical trials to see what potentially worked and why, and perhaps for hints of what might work in future, as well as potentially making use of data that comes in. So interesting scenario of kind of, I suppose, the chicken and the egg there, as it were. The other thing that's come up a few times in discussion, you've both mentioned it already, is this idea of genomic data. Could you, Miles, go into a little bit of detail about, first of all, where that genetic data, genomic data, is coming from, and how you think it could be useful in gut reaction? Because it takes up, it's not simple to use genetic data directly necessarily, is it?
I mean, the answer is it can be. As a doctor, as a clinician, we spend a lot of our time using imperfect information to work with our patients to come up with decisions about how we're going to do next. And to my mind, the availability of genetic information is really just part of that information that you can use to help you to make those decisions. I think it's easy to overcomplicate what genetic information is, or to get very hung up on the idea that it is somehow different or magical. It really isn't. And as time goes by, I think we will find ways to use it in a more useful way to help to guide our treatment decisions. This is already happening in the area of cancer, as you well know, Amanda, and others may be aware as well. That's in a slightly more complicated context, using what's called genome sequencing, very detailed genetic analysis of the tumor, to help select the appropriate and the correct treatment. In inflammatory bowel disease, we're going to be doing something less complicated than that, based off the genetics, which we can study based on the blood samples of people, but really using that to help us to guide our treatment decisions, both in terms of selecting drugs which are less likely to be dangerous or toxic. Sometimes you can pick those things from the genetic analysis, and hopefully if either the genetic analysis or some combination of the genetics and the microbiome, the poop analysis that we were speaking about, that if we can make sense of that, that those things I think will play an important role. They'll be part of, well, they're not going to be, it's never going to be, that's going to give you all of the information and therefore the answer is X, but it's going to contribute to our more complete understanding as to what the right decision is for a given person. And I think that's where we're trying to get to.
So rather than being a sort of a silver bullet, they're all pieces of this puzzle.
They're all parts of the jigsaw. And of course, Nick is much more of an expert on this than I am. Part of the complexity of this is bringing these information strands together so that they can be interpretable. Because as things get more complicated, it's likely that no one single element of this is going to give you the answer. All right. The answer is going to come from some combination of genetic data, microbiome data, image analysis data, digital pathology data, clinical data, demographics, age, Nick's already mentioned, gender, so on and so forth, and so a big part of the challenge here, and this is a big challenge in medicine going forward, and this is part of the reason why for me gut reaction and these digital hubs are important, is how do we aggregate these data real time so that when you're sitting in the clinic with your doctor, on the computer in front of them is a mechanism that aggregates this data. And the danger is that we compound the problem that Nick's alluded to of having different hospital systems, radiology on one, pathology on another, but that we end up with even more complicated data that you just cannot interpret because it requires AI and machine learning and all that sort of stuff. So that's an exciting challenge for the for the next 5 years, as I see it.
Yeah, and actually I think one of the purpose of the different hubs is to try and enable us to learn how data is being used in other research areas. So you mentioned cancer, there's some in emergency care, there's some in pain and in mental health, to try and help us understand how to make use of these really huge quantities of data. Since the topic of the microbiome keeps coming up, Nick, I hear you're an expert in this area. Do you think you could give us a few sentence in beginner's guide to the microbiome and what it does for IBD?
Sure. So the microbiome sort of is a description of all of the different microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, fungi, and so forth that live in and on our body. We, I guess, in IBD particularly focus on the gut microbiome, so looking at what lives in our gut, and they're almost like another organ in that they deal with lots of aspects of metabolism and sort of turning aspects of what we eat into other things and breaking down drugs and so forth. And we know from research across a whole range of areas that the types of bugs we have in our gut can influence lots of complex aspects of health and disease, including inflammation. We've known for some time that with both Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, patients who have those conditions have differences in the types of bugs that live in their gut. And it's not that there's a single bug where we can say this bug is causing this patient's Crohn's disease. It's just the bugs, the overall sort of family of bugs that live there that look different. And we think that they are involved in the disease process. So we know that when people have done experiments in animal models of inflammatory bowel disease, that if you don't have the bugs around, they don't get the disease, but also that if you transfer the wrong types of bugs from one animal to another, you can bring on sort of disease-like states as well. So the bugs are definitely important. At the moment, we've got fairly crude tools for trying to manipulate the bugs that live in our guts, but we aren't in the UK doing any sort of routine use of that, other than certain specific things like giving antibiotics to treat perianal Crohn's disease, for example. But we will make progress, hopefully, over time in understanding sort of therapeutics within the microbiome space, so being able to hopefully modify the pattern of bugs that live in the gut to a more sort of healthy status, and hopefully alongside other aspects of disease treatment that may be a cause, a way of improving people's care. The other thing that Miles has referred to is that because the bugs we have in our gut influence the way drugs are processed and have all these other influences on us, it may be possible to get a readout of the types of bugs there and use that alongside other tools to try and understand whether a patient's likely to respond to a specific drug. And so the project that we've both referred to, IBD Response, I think gives us a really good opportunity to do that in a large number of patients with inflammatory bowel disease, so that we can hopefully use that alongside these other omics, these other genetics, and measuring which genes are turned on and all sorts of other things, and alongside the clinical information to make more informed decisions around treatment.
Mm-hmm. I think it's absolutely fascinating to think that just the bugs in our tummies are having such a role on things. And I think it just goes to underscore just how complex all of these different influences are, and perhaps just how important things like gut reaction are to bring all these little clues together and try and understand what's working. So Rosanna and Caroline, given all the different types of data that we've been talking about, right down to the types of bugs that live in your tummies and live in your poo, etc., does it make you feel differently about how this is working based on those different types of data? Are there areas where you're more concerned or less concerned, or in the sum of things? What do you think, Rosanna? I think it's your turn to go first again.
I think it's a combination of the two. I'm really struck by, as a patient, you sort of, we go to the doctors, we go to the hospitals, we have lots of blood tests, we visit the hospital, we have images taken, and you're just aware that all these things are sitting around on computers somewhere. And you just think, if someone could sort of pull all this together and not just pull it together for you, but to pull it together for kind of thousands of people, you might just begin to see some patterns. Because I think something we hear over and over again is nobody's Crohn's is the same as another person's Crohn's, and nobody's ulcerative colitis is the same as another person's. And I guess it's very frustrating as a patient, but I guess it's equally frustrating as a clinician, having to try and support and doing that bit, well, maybe we'll try this, or maybe we'll try that kind of thing, because we as patients go, no, I want something that's going to fix it now. So I guess I'm incredibly supportive of seeing that happen. And I think what I'm also struck by is how the numbers of things have grown over time. So at the beginning, when we as patients were involved in this, we were just, well, for me, I can only speak for myself, I guess, I was thinking, potential for new drugs and things like that. But actually, the longer it goes on and the more you understand about the potential of these different types of data, including the amazing bugs in your tummy or whatever, you see actually there's lots of scope for other things like, what about new diagnostic tools? So you don't have to have a colonoscopy and things like that. So there's loads of potential out there. And again, we say it over and over again, the fact that patients have different views about data, and so long as we have patients involved, you've got a range of perspectives about what they think is okay and what they don't think is okay. We can come up with systems that will make sure our really precious data is safe, but also that it doesn't just sit there on those computers and not used. Sorry, that was a rather long answer. I didn't mean to take up so long.
In your defense, I did ask the question, so it's only fair. Thanks, Rosanna. Caroline, is there anything you want to add on top of that?
Yeah, just really just to add to that, I think the whole new emerging technology, data usage, new science in areas such as the microbiome and so on. And I know lots of, as well as clinicians, patients are really interested in these areas as well, and they are complex. So it represents a real, if you like, a brave new world opportunity. If we can harness it in the right way to advance our understanding, prevention of diseases, and of course, treatment improvements as well. I think that our challenge as patient representatives is around, the maximising certainly the benefits of these opportunities, making sure that those aren't missed, making sure there aren't unwarranted obstacles in the pathway of all of that. But also we have a responsibility just to make sure that the use of data in this process is not misused, and also that there aren't any other potential patient risks that come from this brave new world. And it was really important that, and I think gut reaction has been good in this respect, that as patient representatives on the PAC or Patient Advisory Committee, that our opinions were informed opinions, but also balanced with our lay perspective on that. So we had lots of development in areas like polygenic risk scores, and as Miles mentioned, you know, artificial intelligence in health, all these really potentially complex areas, which, unless we were given some information and development on, could pass by patients who maybe wouldn't have an informed opinion then to represent on behalf of other patients. And just as Rosanna is saying, you know, in order to harness those benefits and advance all of those benefits that we talked about from these opportunities of new science and new technology, I think gut reaction has a real advantage because, as Miles and Nick have touched upon, because of the scale, the breadth and the diversity of the data, it's more likely that the outcomes are better tested, better evidenced, and more quality outputs to identify those patterns that Rosanna talked about, because we want research to move away from just identifying the kind of correlating things versus what's causing things. So when both Rosanna and I and the other patients on the patient review processes, when we're looking at these areas, we're trying, I think most of us are trying to come at it from that balance of, you know, trying to get that, you know, making sure that we don't miss those opportunities, and also making sure that there isn't any misuse of those opportunities as well.
Thank you both. There's lots of things, lots of questions come to mind just from my perspective based on those. But I think one of the things I hear from what you've just said now, Caroline, is that it's not just about the data in the end, is it, in terms of your patient concerns? It's the new things that comes out of that, the AI, as you say, the what does it mean if we have polygenic risk scores, and what if something else new comes up? And I suppose it's part of this idea that gut reaction still has to be an ongoing conversations with patients. It's not kind of, you know, one and done and we've covered it. It's going to be about working together throughout as we keep, you know, finding these new things, but then the questions and concerns that go with whatever's new. I think based on what we've all talked about so far, there's some clear patterns emerging about what some of our goals are for gut reaction. So finding the right treatment for the right patient as quickly as possible, so less of the trial and error, of course, new treatments. But Rosanna, you also just said something very interesting around the area of diagnostics. And I was just wondering whether or not either Miles or Nick might like to come in about whether or not that sounds like something that gut reaction could look at in terms of trying to find new ways of diagnosing.
So I think one of the subsets of patients the IBD bioresource has gone after is an inception cohort, so people early in their diagnostic state. And I think there are opportunities to look at what the sort of data looks like early on in someone's diagnostic journey, and see whether we can get a good enough signal from non-invasive tests to be able to predict what's going on. I think some of that will also need to involve comparing those, obviously, with people who don't have inflammatory bowel disease in the diagnostic setting, which is something that hasn't been done so much as part of the IBD bioresource and gut reaction, although there are other data sources that we can turn to get a comparison population. I think there's also opportunities in that early sort of diagnostics that there's partly, does the patient have inflammatory bowel disease? And so it's about building better tools to perhaps screen an at-risk population and identify it early, or identify it in a less invasive way than we currently do. And then there's also questions around whether we can develop tools that allow us to predict someone's disease course early on. So not just about which drugs to give them, but about whether to give them drugs at all, perhaps, or at least whether to give them some of the more powerful drugs that we have. And Miles might like to speak to that, because he's obviously been involved for some time in work in that side of things as well.
Absolutely. Miles, would you like to come in there for that discussion?
Sorry, Nick, specifically what?
I was thinking about sort of, although some of this predates gut reaction, but some of the work you've been involved in looking at risk prediction. So not just thinking about who has IBD, but if they have IBD, how aggressive is their disease going to behave?
Yeah, that is an important that is an important question, and I think there are various different tools that people are using, and we're studying one particular version of that here in Cambridge, and with a big multi-centre study across the country as well. We're into this vexed question, aren't we, of can you predict IBD, and would that be a useful thing to do? Or having diagnosed IBD, can you predict what's going to happen to the individual in front of you? The latter is, for a combination of statistical reasons, which Nick understands better than I do, the latter is a much more tractable goal. Regrettable as it is, we would all love to prevent people getting IBD. That's a sort of more longer term aspiration, I would suggest. I think in the short and medium term, I think the thing that gut reaction is particularly well equipped to do is to address this question, which Nick has just identified. The can you predict the disease course based on information that gut reaction holds? To me, this is one of the potentially the most exciting aspects of the digital pathology thing, Nick. I don't know whether you agree with this, but I think that is going to be an amazing resource, given that we know what we know about AI. Are there particular features that when you point a computer at a digital slide of somebody's biopsy, will your computer pick features on those index biopsies that tell you that this individual is destined to have a relatively mild disease course or a more severe disease course? I think that's going to be really interesting. Can we integrate that information with other bits of the jigsaw puzzle? I hope so. Again, as Nick knows well, and Caroline, you already mentioned polygenic scores, which I could bore on about for days, but which we mustn't do. Polygenic scores is this idea of using all of the information across the genome to help you predict future events, put it like that. And one of the things which I think polygenic scores may do, but which requires really big, seriously big numbers of people to be able to do this, is to develop polygenic scores to help us predict disease course and to help us predict treatment response as well. But we need to be then studying not 35,000 people, but probably 150,000, 200,000 people with IBD to begin to get traction on that. But that's part of our ambition in our UK research group, to be honest with you. Don't tell the funders that immediately. We're letting them down gently into this idea, but I think that should be a medium-term ambition for us, to be honest with you. It goes back to this question of shouldn't we be just doing this genetic analysis on everybody, because there are so many different ways in which it can influence how we think about health and treatment choices, not just in IBD. It's the same platform that influences treatment choices in cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, blood pressure, cancer, and so on and so forth. And once you've got the information, you can use it in all of these different arenas to help you make your treatment decisions. And then you begin to justify getting these sorts of numbers that you need to develop these sorts of prognostic scores. So that's part of the sort of longer term vision. But I think it's the cost of doing this is now relatively modest. The genetic analysis costs about £20 or £25. That's in healthcare terms is a very modest amount of money, actually.
So it sounds as though then the data that we have available through gut reaction, we can use, there's potential for use in diagnostics, there's potential for use in developing treatments and understanding prognosis. And we've sort of talked a little bit about prevention, although it sounds as though that might be more of a longer term goal. Miles, you just mentioned just now some larger numbers. So is one of the plans or goals or dreams for gut reaction to be able to get some more numbers to be able to answer some of those finer questions, or is it kind of more of a let's learn to use what we've got and then look at expanding in the future?
Well, one thing I learned early on from a guy called John Todd, who used to be a diabetes geneticist here in Cambridge, he's gone back to Oxford now. I first met him when I was in Oxford and he was there as well, was that numbers really count in this type of analysis. And there are some people who get a bit offended by that and feel that that's just not the right way of going about things. But for sure, in the world of genetics, having big numbers of participants in your research programs is really what drives the validity of the findings that you get and allows you to see that much further. And so, given what I just said about the cost of these things coming down, given that the technology can be pointed in lots and lots of different directions, some of which are immediately clinically impactful, others of which are more in the research environment, then I would dearly love to see ourselves in a situation whereby we can recruit most, if not all, of the people in the UK who've got Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis to these types of studies. Whether or not we can align all of their secondary routinely collected healthcare data in secondary care, I doubt. But who knows? We may be able to get more of it, as Nick's alluded to. Some of the data systems are getting better and better able to talk to each other. Nonetheless, secondary care, by which I mean hospital care data, is quite fragmented and quite tricky to put together. But there are other bits of information that we might well be able to aggregate, including, lo and behold, asking our patients to help us to fill in some of the information that we're missing, not relying on hospital systems at all.
Yeah, and I think some of what we're learning is kind of what works for hospitals, for clinicians, for some types of data sets, and what doesn't work. And I think we've learned a bit about what doesn't work as well, in the hope that as we get better at this, we can sort of make it easier to be able to make use of these huge data sets that we have.
Yeah, it's an irony, isn't it, that NHS Digital, which is funded by the government to aggregate data and make it available to the research community, does a good job of aggregating data, and then also does an equally good job, unfortunately, of fending off anybody who tries to get their hands on the data to use it for what it's designed for.
Yes, I think if we've learned anything, is that there's complexity at all levels for this particular project, but nevertheless, progress is being made. So we were initially funded for 3 years, and we've heard from both of you that we're in a good position to support research using gut reaction. We know that the IBD bioresource has got in the region of 36,000 consented patients. We've got 13 NHS trusts. So I think we're in a really good position for research. What do we know about gut reaction moving forward, Miles? Can you kind of update us on what are the next steps?
So in many senses, this is the most exciting time for gut reaction. And insofar as we've now got the data in-house, as it were, it's taken much of the last 3 years. Of course, the pandemic really didn't help to get all this data in one place. But that is now the situation that we find ourselves in. So to me, this is the most exciting and potentially productive time for gut reaction to really sharpen its claws and to get people going on the data. The overarching mechanism that underpins gut reaction will continue to fly. As you say, the grant itself is finished, but the NIHR bioresource, which is, as I mentioned before, the platform on which gut reaction is built, is, as it were, taking on a lot of the support of the gut reaction data set and ensuring that is then available to the research community. The patient advisory committee is now also playing a really central role in the review of proposals that come in to gut reaction, and I'm sure that will remain an important mechanism, not just for IBD, but actually also showing the way vis-a-vis patient involvement in data access in lots of other areas. And I think people are really learning all the time about how to do this well and how not to do it as well. I think that's important. So yeah, there are use cases still coming in. We make it clear to everybody, and we put this around at various meetings and conferences and publicity events and stuff, that the resource is available for people to use. From wherever they come from. They just have to fill in an application form and demonstrate that they have ethical approval for their proposal and that it meets a couple of fundamental criteria. Most importantly, that the proposal will be of benefit to the patient community, and that it's a scientifically tractable and interesting question. Therefore, that it's sort of fit for purpose in terms of for use of gut reaction. But provided it does that and that we can do it, then we are keen to support programs. I don't want to become the next NHS Digital, that having assembled this perfect data set that we then fend off anybody who has the temerity to try and get access to it. That would be a big mistake in my view.
Yes, that would rather undo all the hard work that everyone's done, wouldn't it?
Right.
Rosanna, as the longest standing member of the PAC, are you happy with the progress that PAC has made? As we've sort of talked about, as that gut reaction has made, as we've talked about, you've been with us from the start. What are your reflections as we come up to sort of the end of the first period, as it were, and what more would you hope to see?
That's a good question, actually. I think, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's a complex project, which I hadn't realised back at the beginning, and there are a lot of stakeholders involved, and nothing ever moves as quickly as you think it might. And as Miles has alluded to, the pandemic has obviously not helped that even more. But I think we've made some great strides in lots of areas. I think obviously for me personally, the increased level of involvement from patients in the project, you know, from at the beginning where there was just me to growing sort of, you know, a wider group and being conscious of trying to make the group as diverse as possible, and working hard to get lots of different voices. So that, I think that's been a real achievement as well. And I think the other thing that I've started to see emerging, and again, I hope we can do more of this, is for patients to be not just involved in the choosing of, you know, which studies come through, so as in the applications come to us, but maybe for the patient community to be more involved in deciding what sort of research we'd like to see. I do think the more informed as like patients and the public we are about the potential of data, the more likely we are to be the ones, you know, we've got either Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, so going around in our daily lives, we know what might help us. And as wonderful as all those new drug treatments might be, they might be a little way off, but there is research we can do now that helps us to keep in remission, that can help us to kind of go about and have our daily lives. So I look forward to more of that really, and think we've really sort of coming a long way, as I said, and having set it all up and gone through all those hiccups on the way, I think we are in sort of a good place now to, you know, get going at a rate of knots, I hope.
Absolutely. As I introduced it, oh, sorry, yes, Mars, do you want to come in?
So, Amanda, I was just going to butt in with a different hat on that I wear here, as you well know, Amanda. We've looked at a project recently run in cystic fibrosis, and there's an amazing story there of one of our academically oriented guys who is also a wizard on AI. One of his patients was a lad with cystic fibrosis who was admitted close to the beginning of the pandemic and was an inpatient for a long time. With bad lungs, and it so happened that his father works for Microsoft in Cambridge, and between the doctor Andres Floto, the dad, the boy, and Microsoft, they put together this amazing program, and they've written an app that allows home monitoring for early detection of deterioration in cystic fibrosis. And it's absolutely flown in terms of take up by a sort of translational research level, because it's part of the how do you keep well if you've got cystic fibrosis. And there are, of course, analogies of this to Crohn's disease as well. And it's integrating all of these different home monitoring things that people can do at home, you know, pulse in their world, it's pulse oximetry and respiratory rates and other nuanced aspects of physiological monitoring to do with your chest, and then detecting early signs of deterioration and early home antibiotics and preventing hospital admission. So it just goes to show what patient communities can do, well motivated and with the right contacts. And patient communities have got as good a contacts as we've got in terms of, you know, plugged into Microsoft or whoever else it is. And it would be great, as Rosanna says, to see some of these projects being led and driven by patient communities. And there are mechanisms, as you know, again, Amanda, the patient-led research hub in Cambridge can support patient groups that want to do this. And Nick, I don't know if Exeter has the equivalent, but there are these organizations around that can support patient-led research programs to get up and going. Just a brief flag and an advert for that.
Oh, and it's a useful segue. All I was going to add on top of that is exactly as we said about gut reaction, bringing together expertise. This patient expertise has been a crucial part of it. And it's just fascinating that even in the 45 minutes that have been discussing this, how many different areas between us we've all identified gut reaction could be used for, and then even on top of that, even more. So there is so much potential there if we can just get researchers, as you say, Mars, with the right kinds of questions and things, asking those right questions, making use of this data that we have, and hopefully finding some things that make the difference both for patients and their clinicians. Caroline, building on the answer of Rosanna just now, so you've been a PAC member, as you say, for a slightly shorter time. What would you like to see from gut reaction moving forward? What are your next steps?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the research that I would like to see come via gut reaction as part of this bigger picture, I mean, the scope is potentially huge. Obviously, the Holy Grail is a cure. And ultimately, as a patient, I think we all share that wish. But there's lots of important areas with that aside to improve patients' lives in all aspects that potentially could come from opening up the research opportunities via gut reaction. We've touched on it before about, you know, right at the top of clinicians' lists, but also in patients' priority lists. You know, we've, as a patient advisory committee, we've done lots of discussion and research on what actually are patients' priorities to enable us to give that perspective when we're representing patients. And, you know, right at the top, naturally comes right treatment first time, personalising treatment, which we talked about, understanding and predicting individual disease. And that is rightfully the priority areas that I would like to see gut reaction opening up. But also, in particular, I would really like to see research opportunities open up on research on IBD outside of the bowel. Okay. So a large, huge proportion of patients live with what's called extra intestinal manifestations, including me, and correlating disease to their IBD that affects other areas, their eyes, their bones, their skin, mental health, and other health vulnerabilities. So opening up research in those areas, I think, is really crucial. And from a patient advisory perspective, I was really excited by the fact that in our review process, of data access process, essentially any research which even mentions IBD will come via that. So we get to scrutinize and review that. So that's exciting in terms of identifying these outside of the bowel research areas. And we've mentioned before, I'm touching on, it's really important, the whole area of monitoring our disease. It is difficult, it is more invasive than in other conditions. So opening up research that's kinder and more efficient and effective in monitoring and surveilling our diseases is really important to keep a check on that inflammation and erosion. Yeah, so those kinds of opening up what new research in those areas, but also continuing to build on research that's already started in those kinds of areas. I think gut reaction could be a really important vehicle for those.
Yeah, I can see some vociferous nods from Rosanna agreeing with that. Rosanna, are there any areas that you would have dreaming for gut reaction about what we could look that we haven't covered in your other answers?
I think it's sort of just reflections on the things that sort of Caroline has said, really, the idea of being able to sort of, you know, monitor things more yourself, or to be able to do that in ways without always necessarily having to go via GPs or go to clinicians. So the ideas of things like apps and that, you know, is very appealing. I think we as patients like to do what we can to try and take some control where possible, because, you know, that's one of the horrible things about IBD. It's unpredictable nature, and the fact that you do feel like you don't have control over things. So I think anything that sort of goes with that. I have a particular interest in the mental health connections of having like physical disease as well. So that's something that's really important to me. Research in areas, interesting that it crosses over with many conditions. So fatigue, pain, those kinds of things, that's not just happening in IBD, that's actually happening in lots of conditions. So I think the potential for our source of data to interest researchers, you know, wider than in the IBD field, it is really great as well. And, you know, as Miles alluded, it could be a model for research either within other, you know, immune related diseases or even wider than that.
Brilliant, thanks. So before we move on to some of the questions from the audience, I've got just two last questions that kind of draw together a lot of what we've been talking about. So it feels as though there's really quite a community feel to IBD research. I say this as an outsider, both from patients and clinicians and researchers across the field. Nick, as a question for you, do you think there's anything further that gut reaction can do to kind of capitalise on this research community to help sort of get it as far as it can go?
So firstly, I completely agree that there has been a great community to IBD research. I think internationally, and I think the genetics has led on that, but perhaps particularly in the UK, and I've spent several years working in Australia as well, where there is a good consortium of people interested in IBD genetics. But I think It's been particularly strong here. I think it's perhaps become even stronger with some of the cross-site working we've done during the pandemic, looking at the interactions between COVID and IBD that I've been involved in. And I think it's really important we build on that. I think we build on those relationships between clinicians and researchers and patients, as you say, and make sure that we maintain that engagement, both in terms of continuing to recruit patients to studies, but also in terms of setting the agenda for what questions we're trying to answer. I think one of the great things about the bioresource and gut reaction is that it's, rather than just answering a single research question, it's building a resource which is open to researchers from that broader community to ask important questions without necessarily having to build into their project the resource to recruit 10,000 patients, because they're already recruited. So I think it's making sure that people are in the broader research community are aware of that and continue to ask and answer those questions. Even more broadly, perhaps, I think there is more opportunity than we've currently taken advantage of to work across disease areas. So I think research within IBD has been very collaborative. I think there are collaborative networks of people doing rheumatological research and skin research, looking at related conditions. Obviously, that becomes particularly pertinent with what Caroline was saying about extraintestinal manifestations of IBD, but also looking separately at things like psoriatic arthritis or rheumatoid arthritis or psoriasis and so forth. And I think there are opportunities to perhaps move even further beyond just engaging with a collaborative network of IBD physicians to working across the immune-mediated inflammatory disease spectrum. And again, I think COVID has started to strengthen some of those links further, and we should take that forwards.
Brilliant, thank you. And Miles, we opened this discussion talking about the essential contributions of all of the patients that are already taking part in research through the NIHR IBD bioresource. Could you just finish by reminding people, if they are interested in getting involved in that, what's the easiest way that they can get involved in research?
So most, but not all, hospitals around the UK are recruiting to the IBD bioresource, and I'm afraid that at the moment, at least, it is a requirement that your local hospital is set up to do this. If it is, and the research nurses or doctors that you speak to should know the answer to that, but are not guaranteed to, actually you can check on the IBD bioresource website. That should give you an indicator as to whether your hospital is or isn't a participating site. And if it is, then don't take no for an answer, and please do go and badger the clinicians in your hospital. One of the sadnesses of the pandemic is that with the real move to remote consultation, which I appreciate is much more convenient for many people for much of the time, nonetheless it has slightly put a hole below the waterline for research recruitment in many senses. So yeah, we're really grateful to people who put themselves forward. So thank you.
Right. So thank you very much to all of our panelists. We are almost done, but not quite. So I'm going to give you some of the questions that have come in live from the audience. And the first one will be either probably for Miles or Nick. There's a question from Harry who says, as it is thought that Crohn's has an inheritance connection, what genetic research is being carried out to see if any particular gene is responsible, and any idea when research might be available so that treatment can be found?
I'll take that one, Nick, if that's right. So the answer is that lots of research has been done over the last 15 or 20 years in exactly this question. Taking large groups of people who've got Crohn's disease, for example, and comparing their genetic makeup in aggregate to people who don't have Crohn's disease. And when you do that, you can then look for particular genes which contain genetic variants which are more prevalent or more common in people with Crohn's disease than in people who don't have Crohn's disease. And that then gives you a clue that those genetic variants are somehow playing a role in increasing the risk of getting Crohn's disease. Those studies have been done at scale in the UK and internationally. I can see among our attendees on the call today, we've got Laura from the Sanger Institute, Laura Fashal, who is leading the world research in this area, studying, I think, 100,000 people with inflammatory bowel disease. Laura could correct me if I'm wrong. She could put that in the chat. Again, going back to what I was saying earlier on, the bigger the studies you do, the more you can find out. And there's a straight line relationship with those. Already, a number of the genetic signals that we've identified already map onto some of the treatments that we've got. which kind of reinforces how valuable this information could be. And of course, it's also true to say that that the pharma industry have paid very close attention to the findings for these sorts of studies. And most, not absolutely all, but most drug therapies that are in development for IBD now have got at least an evidential basis from the genetic studies that they are likely to be relevant. Some interesting studies showing, or data showing that if your new treatment, your new drug has got a basis in genetics, it's more than twice as likely to get through and be a successful drug treatment at the end of the day compared to drugs that don't start off with that as their basis. And the pharma industry, given the cost of developing drugs, the pharma industry have really clocked that bit of information. So yes, across the genome, there are now, I think, 300 areas of the genome, maybe 400 areas of the genome, which are very clearly associated with increased risk of Crohn's disease. And of course, there are patterns within that data. They're not 400 random things. There are very much patterns within those data sets about connectivity between the function of those genes.
Okay, so it's not as simple as a single gene, but there are lots of signals coming from.
Yeah, there are lots of things that in combination together. And I saw there was some other questions about, is it all then the genes or are the environmental things? So it's a combination of those things. It's a combination of the environmental risk factors. We don't understand so much about those yet, and that genetic predisposition.
Yeah. Another pattern that's coming up in the questions actually is there's quite a few questions around subtypes of IBD, and then also things that are related to IBD, so things like IBS, for example. Either Miles or Nick, could you just comment on what you know about research that's looking into trying to pull apart some of these different subtypes and whether or not gut reaction might be useful as a tool for doing some of that untangling?
Sure. So I've seen some of the questions come through on this. The sort of prerequisite for coming into the IBD bioresource and to gut reaction is a diagnosis of Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, or inflammatory bowel disease unclassified. So that will mean that, for instance, eosinophilic gastroenteritis, which I think is one of the questions, won't be covered by what we're doing at the moment. It is a condition that's of interest in its own right. One of the difficulties from a research perspective is that it's rare, and so getting enough patients with that condition to answer the types of questions we're doing with something like gut reaction is challenging, but it doesn't mean it's not important to look into. I think in terms of, there was a question around bile acid malabsorption or bile acid diarrhea, which is increasingly recognised as a cause of chronic diarrhea, both in people with predisposing conditions like Crohn's disease or people who've had bowel surgery, but also in people who might otherwise have been labelled as having irritable bowel syndrome. It's not something, Miles can correct me if I'm wrong, it's not something I think we specifically looked at in gut reaction at the moment, but certainly in the subgroup of patients who have inflammatory bowel disease and have bile acid diarrhea, there may be opportunities to answer some of the questions about it within gut reaction. Some of those may be relevant in other settings as well. Some of them may be different to what's going on in a population who don't have inflammatory bowel disease. Irritable bowel syndrome is much more common than IBD. It is something that's an active area of research in its own right. Miles and I were co-authors on a paper with colleagues from the Sanger and elsewhere using the UK Biobank, not the IBD Biobank, which is a study of the general population looking at the genetics of irritable bowel syndrome. And that's one of the largest studies, perhaps the largest study to be published so far, looking at that, and did give some interesting insights. So it is an area of active research. It's something we're interested in, but again, it's something that's perhaps a bit different to the patient population we're looking at within gut reaction. There are patients with IBD who probably get an IBS-like pattern once their disease is under control, and there may be opportunities again at looking at that, and there may be parallels between what happens in those people and what happens in a sort of post-infection IBS state, which at least explains some of why people develop irritable bowel syndrome. Miles, any other comments on any of those?
Yeah, I can't remember whether it was this question or a different question, but there was one about, do the genetics of IBD overlap with the genetics of any other conditions? And the answer is that yes, they do in an interesting way. So at the core of these things, there's quite a lot of the gene signals that do overlap, both with conditions we know are related. So ankylosing spondylitis and psoriasis are two examples of those things, but actually as well with other things which are less obviously connected. Things like lupus or type 1 diabetes, which are also immune-related conditions. but less obviously connected. So yeah, there is overlap, and the reasons for that, the genes sometimes overlap, but with different variants associated with these things. So again, it's quite complicated. But once we can begin to understand that, I think that will provide some fairly fundamental insights as to what's going on and why these genes are important, and how what they do is shaping the immune response.
Thank you both. That was very comprehensively answered. I've got a question that's a little bit of a change of tack. So we have a question from someone that says, how diverse is your patient data? Sorry, my inner South Australian coming out there. And what ways are you seeking a diverse and inclusive data set?
Rosanna, do you want to pick that up?
I can't.
From the PAC perspective, I was going to bring you in second, but yes, you want to.
Yeah, I can certainly speak to it from that perspective, and I think it is something. I think it's something that's an issue beyond gut reaction and in all kinds of health research, that we do need a more diverse group of people to be involved and to have their say across all sorts of areas of health as well. I mean, particularly people from particular sort of ethnic minority communities, but also like young people as well. They're going to be using the health service of the future. So sorting it out for them now and getting their voices involved will be like really important. I know certainly as the PACs evolved over time that the partners at Crohn's and Colitis UK have also, that's my doorbell, I apologise, hopefully someone will answer it, who've been involved with this. They've also like worked hard sort of in the wider patient community to involve people, not just patients, but carers and that as well, to be involved with the PAC. And we have grown the group, and as it's sort of morphed over time into the patient review group that's going to look at access applications, then we do have a more diverse group, but it remains something that is an issue for patient involvement in all areas of research, and anything clinicians can do and other patients can do to publicize it within their communities or with their friends, or those badger their doctors or whatever, then I would certainly fly the flag for doing that for sure.
Brilliant, thanks.
Can I just add to that one, Amanda? Yeah, it's something that as currently a patient advisory committee, and as Rosanna mentioned, we've taken steps to try and incorporate more diverse voices within that committee, but also within the patient and public review group, looking at applications going forward. We've had an induction with lots of materials and frameworks and so on, and that our frameworks for reviewing applications very much focuses on the quality of the research, and one of the major elements is in relation to the diversity and inclusion of the application in itself. So it is a high priority in terms of analysing the applications that come through, as well as the diversity of the voices commenting on it. And I was just going to chip in my own little hope for the future of gut reaction, that we do incorporate more and more trusts to widen that scope even further, to ensure that diversity is there, so that the research outcomes are as high quality as possible, taking into account the richness and the diversity of the data that it brings. In particular, I'm really keen on expansion with more of the devolved nations getting involved in gut reaction. I think I've friends and family all over the UK, and I would really like more trusts involved that are involved in the devolved nations, to increase that the diversity and that inclusion within the programme as well.
Brilliant, thanks. Marcel, do you want to wrap up?
If I can just step in, sorry, Rosanna, I didn't mean to pitch that at you in a slightly unhelpful way. Diversity, listen, it is really important, and it's important on many levels, as we would all appreciate. We are reasonably diverse in the IVD bioresource, and we've tried in selecting the hospitals on which, as we mentioned earlier on, 13 out of over 100 hospitals. So there are over 100 hospitals do bioresource, 13 currently doing gut reaction, and we've tried to select or enrich, I should say, the gut reaction hospitals for sites that have a greater ethnic diversity in particular, actually. to try and just balance up some of these issues that are alluded to. In the ideal world, we would recruit everybody to all of these studies, of course, and that would address the diversity thing. But I do appreciate it's not as easy as that, and extra efforts do need to be made to reach the underserved communities, and IHR in particular are very aware of that, and we are as well, and do put a lot of effort into trying to reach into those communities.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, Nick, yes.
It's worth saying that genetics in particular is often previously focused on people of white European ancestry, but actually increasingly there are efforts to extend that to looking across different ethnic groups. And what's really interesting is how that actually enriches our overall understanding, not just about those ethnic groups, but about the overall population we're studying. And so it's really important we do that, and we can learn things that are relevant to people of white European ethnicity by looking at people from other ethnicities. So having a diverse involvement is really important on all grounds.
Yeah, as you say, it does underscore just the importance of that. And I actually, one of my understandings is that Crohn's and Colitis UK, I think, are doing some research around ethnicity and IBD and around the question of underdiagnosis as well, and whether or not it looks different for different people, because that makes it even harder to make sure that we're collecting all the people that we need to. I have a really interesting question here, which kind of is a bit the confluence between some of the technical challenges that we go through and the role that patients can play. So there's a question that says, is there a role that patient groups can play in helping the likes of NHS Digital to be more amenable to share data with researchers? I can see Miles is very keen on that. Nick, I can go to you in a second. I will say from my own experience, I do a lot of patient and public involvement, that I have seen this be done. We have had researchers come to us and request specifically patient feedback so that they can take it to, as you say, the likes of NHS Digital as kind of proof that patients were supportive of a particular research question, and kind of narrow some of the concerns down. Whether or not it was 100% effective, I'm not sure, but it definitely does play a role. So researchers should be asking. Nick, in your experience, does that kind of feedback lend weight, do you think? Do you think it would be helpful if we could do it more widely?
So I think it's essential. We're working through some issues with NHS Digital at the moment around the COVID-related project and a change in the permissions for how we access data from them. And actually, they have very much said that they want us to speak to both a representative group of our patients with some specific questions, but also to keep our broader group of patients informed about what we're doing. I think sometimes, as Miles has alluded to, they can be quite rigid, and I think some of the way they think, patients think, I don't think is always necessarily representative of the way at least our patient population does think. So I think having evidence to show that is really powerful. And I think it's really important that we build those sorts of processes into the design stage of study. So we work with our patient panels and patient advisory groups really early on, so that we can demonstrate to organisations like NHS Digital that we have in fact considered that, and that the language we're using to describe to potential research participants about what we're going to do with their data is consistent with what we then actually, the patient's understanding of that is consistent with what we then actually do. And I think in the broader question of how we ensure access, I think as well that's something that perhaps patient groups can help with, ensuring that there is that the importance of making use of this routinely collected data is emphasised when dealing with national bodies.
Excellent, thanks. And Rosanna, did you want, or Caroline, do you want to just come in and comment there as well?
I was just going to add something actually. I think sometimes there's a difference in the perceptions of perhaps patients and members of the public, in the sense that I think perhaps we as patients might be more enthusiastic about our data being used in a safe way than perhaps a kind of a wider public, who are just impossible to define, because I don't know who they are, who is the wider public, because almost everyone's a patient in some way. But I suspect if you talk to patients, they might be more confident. But I think it's something that needs to evolve over time, and it's sort of based in being sort of transparent in the research. So if researchers involve patients at the beginning, if they take them on the whole journey, they're there when they produce their outputs at the end, their papers, their conferences, analysis or whatever, and that it's all very sort of like clearly done, then I think you will be able to take sort of patients and the public with you, and hopefully that will then sort of translate into, you know, more of an acceptance by NHS Digital, who I suspect are, you know, have been cautious for the right reasons, because they are very protective of our data, but it's kind of getting that balance right to just prove that currently researchers are really moving along with patients, so they do things with us and not to us as it used to be in the past.
Brilliant. And I think what a statement to wrap up with. I think that really just highlights the balance of all of the of making sure that we're making use of the data where it's appropriate to do so, but making sure that we're doing so with patients' needs and wants and preferences in mind. So thank you very much to all of our panel members. You have been very, very good sports with my questioning today. A few deviations from our usual script, so they were very good on the fly. And thank you also for answering all the questions at the end. And thank you to the audience as well for putting those questions in the chat. I know we didn't quite get through them all. What we will try and do there was a question about the links. We'll write those links up and we'll pop them on our website. So do check the Gut Reaction website. And for now, from my team and I and the panelists, thank you very much and have an excellent rest of your day.